This is eternal human spirit, where every story proves why humanity never breaks.
The mockery begins. The chamber of the Galactic Council was a place of shining marble and endless echoes. Its ceiling stretched higher than the tallest human building, and its walls glowed with alien runes that shifted like living fire. Creatures from across the stars filled the seats, their many eyes, scales, and wings reflecting the glow of strange lanterns. It was here that the fate of worlds was judged, and it was here that Alara, a young woman from Earth, was led into the circle. The moment she entered, laughter spread through the hall, not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the sharp, cruel kind that cuts deep. Aliens leaned back in their golden chairs, their voices dripping with contempt. "A human! This is the best your planet could send," one of them hissed, his skin shimmering like glass. Another, with a serpent's head and eyes of burning gold, smirked and said, "She is fragile, weak. She looks as if one breath of wind could break her." The hall roared with agreement, their voices rolling like thunder across the chamber. Alara kept her eyes forward, her steps steady. Though her heart pounded inside her chest, she had known this moment would come. She had known the council would mock her, but knowing did not make it easier. Her people had sent her not because she was strong in the way aliens understood strength, but because she carried something else, something hidden, something the aliens would never expect. High above the chamber, the dragons stirred, massive creatures of black iron scales and burning eyes, chained by collars of glowing metal. Their wings stretched wider than the hall itself, and each beat of their hearts shook the air like drums. The dragons had long been slaves of the council, used as weapons in their endless wars. The aliens worshipped their power, yet feared their rage. And even now, the beasts growled low. Restless as they looked upon the small human girl below, more laughter filled the air. "She dares stand before us while the dragons look down on her," a voice shouted. "What can she offer? This child of dirt and water." Another mocked. "She will beg for mercy before the day is over." The serpent-headed alien sneered, baring his fangs. The echoes pressed on Alara like a storm, but she did not break. Instead, she stood at the very center of the circle, her hands clenched at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes cold. Inside, her mind was racing. She remembered the voices she had heard in her dreams as a child, whispers of fire and wings, of chains and sorrow. She remembered the night on Earth when she woke and found her window glowing with the image of a dragon, its eyes staring straight into hers. The others had never believed her when she told them. They had called it imagination, but Alara knew it was more. She had been chosen long before this day, though she did not yet know why. The council leader rose from his seat, his long robes brushing the floor like waves of black water. His voice was deep, and when he spoke, even the dragons lifted their heads to listen. "Human," he said with a sneer, "your kind is young, your bones weak, your lives short, yet you stand here as if you belong among the stars." He raised a clawed hand toward the dragons, their chains rattling in the silence. "If you wish to prove your worth, then show us. Command these beasts, if you can." The chamber burst into wild laughter again, the sound crashing against the walls like a storm. Aliens clapped their hands, their faces twisted in cruel delight. They wanted to see her humiliated, crushed, broken before the creatures she could never control. It was a game to them, nothing more. Alara felt her chest tighten, but she did not step back. She raised her eyes to the dragons, and for the first time she did not see monsters. She saw pain, chains digging into flesh, wings forced to fold, eyes burning with sorrow. The dragons looked down at her, and something passed between them, something the council could not see. A silent recognition, as if they knew her, as if they had been waiting for her voice. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Not yet. The silence grew heavy, pressing down on the chamber. The aliens leaned forward, their laughter fading, their eyes narrowing with curiosity. What was the human doing? Why did the dragons stare at her like that? Elara lowered her head, letting her hair fall over her face. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her voice inside whispered calm. Not yet. Wait. Hold. She clenched her fists tighter, feeling the energy. In the chamber twist around her, the dragons growled low, their chains rattling harder, sparks of fire spilling from their mouths. The council began to murmur in unease. Something was wrong, something they did not understand, but they silenced themselves when the largest dragon spread its wings, the sound echoing like thunder. Its burning eyes locked on Elara, and for the first time in centuries, the creature knelt, lowering its massive head toward the ground. Gasps filled the chamber. The laughter stopped, the whispers turned to silence. The aliens who had mocked her now stared with wide eyes and frozen jaws. Elara raised her head slowly, her eyes meeting the dragon's. A secret burned inside her. Heart, a word unspoken, a bond unbroken, and in that moment, everything began to change. The hidden. Passed long before Elara ever stood inside the chamber of the Galactic Council. Her story had already begun in the quiet fields of Earth, where the sky burned golden at dusk and the winds carried whispers of forgotten times. She had been born in a small village on the edges of the northern mountains, a place untouched by the rush of machines and the roar of cities. From her earliest days, her life had been marked by strange moments that others dismissed as dreams or childish imagination, but for her they were as real as the stones beneath her feet. At night she often woke to find the air glowing faintly, as though unseen. Stars had lowered themselves to her window. Sometimes she heard the sound of wings beating through the sky, though no bird could be seen. And when she closed her eyes, she heard voices deep and heavy, voices that spoke of chains, fire, and endless flight. Her parents thought her fragile, perhaps even sick, for she often wandered to the mountains and stood staring into the clouds, as though she were waiting for something to appear. The other children laughed at her, calling her dreamer, calling her strange. Yet she never stopped listening, for the voices came whether she wanted them or not. One summer's evening, when she was no more than 12, she stood by the river, her feet buried in the cold water, and she whispered a name that had appeared in her dream. She did not know why. She said it, did not know what it meant, but the moment the word left her lips, the water rippled as though stirred by a great force. A shadow swept across the valley, though no clouds were above, and for an instant she saw it, an enormous figure. Soaring high, its wings like burning iron, its eyes like two stars staring straight into hers. Then it was gone, leaving only silence. Yet from that day forward she knew the voices were not only dreams, they were a calling. Her life changed as she grew older, for Earth had begun to take its first trembling steps into the larger galaxy. Human envoys were chosen to represent the planet, and Elara was never meant to be one of them. Yet, when the alien scouts first set foot upon her soil, one of their machines, a towering sentinel bound with living energy, had knelt before her as, though recognizing something the others could not see, the scientists were baffled, the politicians afraid, but the elders of her village whispered that the stars had chosen her. They could not explain it, and neither could she. But soon the stories of the girl who heard voices spread further than her valley, and finally the summons came. The Galactic Council demanded a human delegate, and though the leaders of Earth resisted, the dragons themselves whispered her name. During her long journey across the stars, Elara felt the pull grow stronger. In the silence of the void, she dreamed more clearly than ever before. She saw visions of chains forged in fire, of mighty beasts bending unwillingly to alien masters. She saw great halls filled with laughter that was cruel, and always she heard the cry of creatures that longed for freedom. It was not fear that filled her, but sorrow, for she understood the pain of being mocked, of being underestimated, of being caged by expectations that others forced upon her. She carried that pain quietly, like a secret flame, knowing one day it would burn bright before those who had doubted her. The council had believed she was chosen as a token, a fragile symbol to show that humans wished to take part in galactic unity. They expected her to bow, to remain silent, to listen while they spoke of power and war. What they did not expect was the bond that reached beyond species, beyond stars, beyond chains. They could not know that when she closed her eyes and whispered. Softly, the greatest beasts in the galaxy listened. As she walked the marble halls before being brought into the chamber, memories of her childhood returned with force. She remembered the lonely nights where she sat by the river listening to the wind and wondering why she was different. She remembered the cruel laughter of other children who called her weak, who said her life was nothing but dust. Yet now, those voices seemed distant, replaced by the low growl of wings that had waited centuries for her word. It was as if her entire life had been a preparation for this single moment, a weaving of sorrow and hope into one fragile human frame. And though she felt the weight of countless alien eyes upon her, she carried something none of them could understand. She carried the bond of pain shared with creatures mightier than empires, a bond not built on chains, but on recognition. The aliens thought they had summoned a human girl to entertain their pride, but in truth they had delivered her to the very beings who had whispered her name since childhood. The voices were louder now, filling her thoughts as she stood at the edge of the council chamber. They called not with rage but with longing, with a hunger for freedom that echoed the hunger within her own heart. She did not yet know what she would say, did not yet know how she would act, but she knew one thing with certainty. She was not standing alone. She had never been alone, for the dragons had been with her all along, waiting, watching, listening. And soon the galaxy would discover what that truly meant. The Council's Challenge. The council chamber trembled with the weight of voices rising in cruel amusement, their laughter echoing across the marble walls like a storm that had no end. Aliens of every shape and size leaned forward in their jeweled thrones, their eyes gleaming with malice as they studied the fragile figure of the human girl who stood at the center of their circle. To them she was nothing but a child, a fragile creature of bone and soft flesh, standing in the presence of beings who had conquered stars, worlds, and empires long before humans had even learned to write their own history. At the highest seat, the council leader rose with a slow, deliberate motion. His tall frame was draped in robes of woven black and silver that shimmered with threads of living energy. His eyes glowed like molten suns, and when his clawed hand lifted into the air, the entire chamber fell silent. Even the dragons chained above stilled their restless wings, their growls rumbling low as though they, too, were waiting for what was about to be spoken. "Human!" The leader's voice rolled like thunder through the vast chamber, deep and resonant, shaking the pillars with every word. "Your kind is young, untested, and unworthy of this council. Your lives are no more than flickers, and yet you stand here as if your voice could carry the weight of stars." He turned his hand and gestured toward the dragons, the massive beasts chained to the arches above, their bodies wrapped in glowing shackles that burned against their scales. "If you claim to have worth, then prove it. Command the beasts that bow to none. If you can bend even one to your voice, then perhaps your presence is more than a jest." The laughter erupted again, cruel and mocking, filling every corner of the chamber. Aliens banged their claws against the marble rails, their voices rising in scorn. Some shouted for her to try, others shouted for her to be cast out, and still others laughed so loudly that tears of delight rolled down their alien faces. The noise was deafening, but Alara did not waver. She stood in the center of the storm, her breathing calm, though her heart thundered inside her chest like a drum of war. She looked up at the dragons, and her eyes met theirs for a moment. The noise of the council faded away, and all she saw were their burning eyes staring down at her, bound in chains yet alive with fury and sorrow. Her mind filled with visions not her own, flashes of memory that belonged to them. Battlefields, burning, skies torn apart by war, chains forged in fire and bound tight around their throats. She saw centuries of enslavement, of power stolen, of freedom denied, and she saw something else, a memory of a promise, a whisper carried across dreams, a voice that had once spoken to them in the darkness. Her voice. The aliens mocked her again, their laughter swelling as they saw her silence. "She fears them," one shouted. "She cannot even raise her voice." Another sneered. The serpent-headed noble rose from his seat and hissed, his fangs glinting in the light. "Speak, little human. Tell them to kneel. Let us see the moment when you are broken, when the beasts tear you apart for daring to command them." The chamber shook with more laughter, but the dragons above growled, their massive wings shifting against the chains. Sending sparks of fire cascading into the air, Alara closed her eyes, blocking out the sound. She remembered the nights of her childhood when she heard the whispers in her dreams. She remembered the shadow that once swept across the valley when she spoke the name she did not know. She remembered the feeling of not being alone, even when others laughed at her, and in that moment, she stopped listening to the council and listened instead to the silence between the dragons' breaths, to the rhythm of their hearts that pounded like drums above her. Her lips moved, but the word she whispered was not human. It was a word older than the stars, a sound carried not by her voice alone, but by the fire inside her. The chamber fell into a stunned hush as the word slipped from her mouth, soft but unshakable. The laughter froze, the scornful voices caught in their throats. For something impossible had happened. The largest dragon, a towering beast with scales as dark as night and eyes like molten fire, turned its head sharply, its chains rattled, sparks bursting into the air as its body shifted. The beast's burning gaze locked upon Alara, and the ground shook as it let out a roar that echoed like the end of worlds. The aliens flinched, some covering their ears, some falling back in fear, but Alara did not move. She stood rooted to the marble floor as the dragon's head lowered, lowering, until its massive snout was only a breath away from her small frame. Gasps filled the chamber. Aliens who had mocked her now whispered in terror. "Impossible!" one cried. "They do not obey even us," shouted another. The council leader's eyes widened, his glowing face breaking into something that looked almost like fear. The serpent-headed noble stepped back, his forked tongue trembling. "This is no trick," he hissed. "This is power." The dragon let out a deep growl, but it was not a sound of rage. It was a sound of recognition, of loyalty long denied but never forgotten. Slowly, with a movement that shook the entire hall, the beast bent. One of its massive legs, lowering itself into a bow before the human girl, its eyes, filled with fire, burned only for her. The chamber erupted into chaos. Aliens shouted, screamed, some demanded her death, others cried that it was prophecy. The dragons chained beside the great beast growled louder, their eyes flicking toward Alara as if they too felt the pull. The council, once laughing in mockery, now shook with fear, for what they had thought was a fragile child now stood as something far more dangerous. Alara lifted her head, her eyes shining with a calm fire. She did not speak again, not yet, but inside she knew the truth. The word she had spoken was not simply a command, it was a bond, a bridge between her and the dragons that no chain could ever erase. The aliens could laugh, they could scorn, they could even threaten her life. But the truth had been revealed before their very eyes. The human they mocked was the only voice the dragons chose to obey. The first obedience. The air inside the council chamber grew heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The sound of chains rattling echoed above as the largest dragon pressed its enormous head closer to the ground, its burning eyes fixed on Alara with a focus so intense that even the bravest alien warriors felt their spines turn cold. For centuries, the dragons had been nothing more than living weapons, bound in fire-forged shackles, controlled by pain and fear. Yet now, before all who ruled the stars, one of these mighty creatures bent its knee to a human girl. Chaos spread through the seats of the council. Nobles who had laughed moments earlier now shouted in disbelief, their voices overlapping. In panic, some screamed that it was an illusion, others cried that it was sorcery, and still others whispered of old prophecies long buried. The serpent-headed noble who had mocked her the loudest stood frozen, his forked tongue trembling as he stared at the sight that no alien mind could accept. Dragons had never bowed to anyone willingly, not even to the council who enslaved them, and now their pride had been shattered by a single human whisper. Elara felt her body tremble, not with fear, but with the force of connection that surged through her. The dragon's thoughts, heavy and ancient, pressed into her mind like waves of fire and memory. She saw visions not her own, skies torn apart by battle, mountains crumbling under firestorms, oceans boiling with flame, and through it all, the endless weight of chains digging into flesh and soul. They were not just beasts, they were prisoners, forced into centuries of servitude under masters who saw them only as tools, and now, for the first time in ages, they had found someone who could hear them, someone who could understand them. The council leader slammed his clawed hand against the railing, sparks of energy flashing as his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "This is a trick. No human has such power. Kill her before the beasts break free." His command sent guards rushing forward, armored aliens carrying spears of burning plasma. Their boots struck the marble floor with thunder as they closed in around Elara, raising their weapons high. But the dragon moved first. With a roar that shattered the air, it spread its wings wide, the chains rattling like thunderclaps. The gust of wind from its wings swept across the chamber, hurling the guards back like leaves caught in a storm. Their weapons clattered against the ground, their armor sparking as they slid helplessly across the polished floor. The roar was not one of rage alone. It was a declaration, a warning that no harm would touch the girl standing beneath its shadow. Gasps and cries erupted once more. The aliens who had believed themselves masters of the galaxy now stared in horror as their strongest weapons turned against them. Other dragons, chained beside the great beast, growled louder, their eyes shifting from fury to curiosity as they watched Elara. It was as though her single whisper had rippled through the chains that bound them all, awakening something long buried. Beneath the fire of their captivity, Elara raised her head slowly, her breathing steady though her heart pounded like a drum. She reached out a trembling hand, her palm open toward the dragon before her. The beast's enormous snout lowered until it touched her hand, and the moment their skin met a blaze of energy surged between them. The flames in the dragon's throat dimmed, its growl softened, and in the silence that followed the chamber felt smaller, as though every being within it was witnessing something far larger than themselves. The council leader staggered back, his glowing eyes narrowing with fury. "This cannot be allowed. If the beasts turn to her, the galaxy will burn." His words were filled with fear but also with desperation, for he knew what none of the others would admit. The power to command dragons was greater than any crown, any throne, any empire. If one human could hold that power, everything E&D Council had built over centuries would crumble in a single breath. Whispers spread like wildfire across the chamber. Some aliens cried out that she was chosen, others that she was cursed. A cloaked figure from the far side of the hall rose, their voice sharp and trembling. "The legends were true. The one who speaks with dragons has come, and she is human." Panic followed the words, for every race remembered the old prophecies, the warnings carved into stone, that one day the enslaved would rise at the call of a voice unbroken. The guards tried again to advance, but the dragon snarled, fire spilling from its jaws in rivers of flame that scorched the marble floor. None dared come closer. The other dragons rattled their chains, their bodies pressing against the bindings as if ready to break them apart. Their wings beat against the air. their roars joining into one sound that shook the chamber until dust fell from the ceiling. Alara's mind burned with their cries. They spoke to her without words, pouring their centuries of pain into her soul. She felt the weight of their longing, the chains that dug into not only their bodies but their very spirits. And she realized the truth. The dragons were not kneeling to her because she was strong. They were kneeling because she carried their sorrow as her own. For the first time they had found someone who did not see them as weapons or monsters, but as beings who deserved freedom. Her lips parted, but she did not speak yet. The word she had whispered before was enough to awaken their obedience, but she knew another word could shatter the chains forever. If she spoke it, the galaxy would change in an instant. The Council would lose its greatest weapon and the balance of power would crumble. But if she stayed silent, the dragons would remain enslaved, and humanity would remain mocked. The silence pressed down heavier than stone. Aliens leaned forward, torn between fear and awe. The council leader shouted again, demanding her silence, demanding her death, but his voice trembled. Now, for he no longer commanded the chamber. The dragons did, and they listened only to her. Alara's hand remained against the dragon's snout, her eyes burning with quiet fire. Her choice had not yet been made, but the galaxy already felt the shift. For in that one act of obedience, a single human had done what no empire could achieve. The first chain of fear had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The rising storm, the council chamber had never known such chaos. Once it was a place of control and order, where the most powerful beings of the galaxy ruled with their voices. But now the voices were drowned out by the sound of chains groaning, wings thrashing and fire cracking through the air. The dragons above shifted restlessly, their massive bodies pressing against their bonds, their growls like thunder rolling across the hall. It was as if centuries of silence and obedience had been broken by a single whisper from a human, and now nothing could hold back the storm that followed. Nobles of countless species shouted over one another, some in fear, some in rage, their voices colliding into a roar of panic. One alien pounded his clawed fist against the railing, crying out that the girl must be killed at once before the dragons were lost forever. Another shouted that she was chosen by prophecy, that her presence was destiny, while others demanded soldiers, weapons, or escape from the chamber itself. The serpent-headed noble hissed with venom, his golden eyes flashing with hatred as he called for her execution, yet even he could not hide the tremor in his voice. The council leader stood rigid, his robes flickering, with threads of living energy as he raised his clawed hands to silence the uproar. His voice shook with fury but also with fear. "Do not be fooled. This is no chosen one. This is a threat. If she speaks again, if the beasts rise to her command, then the galaxy will burn in fire and ash. Strike her down, now, before the storm consumes us all." His words carried the authority of a ruler, but the power in the chamber no longer belonged to him. The true power rumbled above, and its eyes burned only for Alara. The guards, their armor scorched and their weapons sparking, from the earlier blast of wings, hesitated as they advanced. Their training told them to obey, to strike the human girl down, yet their instincts screamed against it. The dragons watched them with fire in their throats, every chain rattling like a warning that the slightest harm against her would bring death. One guard lifted his spear, his hands trembling, but before he could strike, the dragon beside Alara released a low growl that shook the floor beneath their feet. The guard stumbled back, dropping his weapon in terror, and the others froze, unwilling to test their fate. Alara stood unmoving at the center of the circle, her hand still resting on the snout of the largest dragon. Her heart was a storm within her chest, yet her face remained calm. She could feel the voices of the dragons pressing into her mind, louder now, clearer, no longer whispers but cries that filled her very soul. They spoke not in words but in feelings, rage, sorrow, longing, hope. It was overwhelming, a tide of emotion so strong that for a moment she felt as if she were drowning. Yet she did not pull away. Instead, she embraced it, letting their pain merge with her own. Visions burned behind her eyes. She saw fields of fire where dragons were forced to fight one another, skies torn apart by alien fleets while their enslaved wings bled flame. She saw their chains forged in the hearts of dying. Stars, powered by cruelty so deep it left scars upon their spirits. She felt their endless desire for freedom, their desperate hunger for release, and she realized that her whisper had been more than a command. It had been a promise. She was the first to hear their cries and answer, the first to see them not as monsters, but as beings who suffered, and they had chosen her not for her strength, but for her recognition. The aliens argued louder, their fear pushing them into madness. Some demanded she be burned, others demanded she be crowned. Some shouted that humanity must be destroyed before more of her kind rose with the same power. The serpent-headed noble screeched, his voice cracking as he pointed toward Alara. "If she frees them, we are all undone. Strike her down now, or the galaxy is lost." His words cut through the noise, and once more guards were summoned, their ranks doubling, their weapons glowing brighter. But even as they gathered there, courage, the dragons began to shift, their wings scraping against the marble ceiling, their eyes blazing with fire that threatened to consume the hall. Alara raised her other hand slowly, her voice caught in her throat. She knew she had a choice to make. She could remain silent, leave the dragons bound, and perhaps live another day. Humanity would remain mocked, seen as weak and fragile, yet the balance of power would not be disturbed. Or she could speak again, say the word that burned on her tongue, and break the chains forever, unleashing creatures whose power could overturn empires and bring the galaxy to its knees. It was a choice between safety and destiny, and the weight of it pressed upon her like a mountain. The chamber fell into uneasy silence, the storm held at its peak, waiting for a single spark. The council leader glared at her, his glowing eyes filled with desperation. "Do not do this, human. You cannot control them. They will destroy you. They will destroy us all." His words trembled despite his defiance, for he too felt the shift in the air. He knew that his empire stood on the edge of collapse, that one whisper from her could shatter everything he had built. Alara's lips parted, her breath slow, her voice almost trembling, but not with fear. With resolve, she felt the dragon's eyes upon her, felt the bond pulling at her very soul, and she understood that silence was no longer an option. The galaxy had mocked humanity, had treated them as nothing. But here, in this chamber, with fire and wings above her, she had been given the chance to change it all. She looked up into the burning eyes of the dragon, and the storm within her heart turned into fire. She knew what she had to do, and though the council trembled, though the guards shook with fear, though the chains rattled with fury, she prepared to speak the word that could change the fate of stars. And as the air crackled with fire and silence pressed like iron upon the chamber, every being within those marble walls realized the truth. The rising storm could no longer be stopped. The human girl had become its heart, and whatever word she chose next would unleash a future none of them could control. The word of power. The chamber had grown so silent that even the sound of the dragon's chains rattling seemed like thunder in the air. Every pair of eyes, alien and beast alike, turned toward Alara, waiting for her next breath. The nobles, once loud with laughter, now sat frozen in their seats, their claws clutching the railings, their scales shivering in unease. The guards held their weapons tight, but none dared step forward, and even the council leader himself, wrapped in his robes of black and silver, seemed shaken by the weight of the moment. Alara stood at the center of it all, her hand still resting on the snout of the largest dragon. Her body trembled, but her gaze was steady. Her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest, yet her voice, though silent, grew stronger. With every passing second, she had heard the cries of the dragons. She had felt their centuries of pain and rage, and she knew what had to be done. The galaxy had mocked her kind, had treated humanity as fragile and unworthy, but she could no longer allow silence to define her people. She would not bow. Not now, not ever. The dragons pressed harder against. Their chains, their wings straining to stretch, their growls filling the chamber with sound so deep it shook the marble floor. Flames leaked from their jaws, burning against the shackles that bound them. Their eyes glowed brighter, as though they sensed what was about to happen. They knew, just as Alara knew, that a single word could end their torment. It was not just a command. It was a promise of freedom, a call that no chain forged in fire could resist. The serpent-headed noble broke the silence with a hiss of rage, his voice sharp with fear. "Do not speak, girl. Do not dare. You will doom us all. Do you think you can control what you do not understand?" He pointed his claw toward her, his eyes glowing gold. "If you free them, they will tear you apart. They will tear us all apart." His words cracked like whips, but there was no strength in them, only desperation. The council leader rose to his feet, his voice booming as he tried to reassert control. "Human, your arrogance blinds you. You think you are chosen, but you are nothing. If you speak, you will destroy your world, your kind, everything. Is that what you want? To see Earth burn as well?" His words were meant to frighten her, to remind her of her people far away. Yet Alara did not flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the dragon's burning gaze, and in that gaze she saw not destruction, but trust. She closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath, and in her silence she returned to the memories of her childhood. She remembered the nights when she sat by the river, whispering words she did not understand to the shadows above. She remembered the time when she spoke a name and saw a dragon's shadow sweep across the valley. She remembered the endless laughter of those who mocked her, calling her fragile, calling her weak. And she remembered the first time she whispered the forgotten word in the chamber and saw the dragons bow. That memory was no longer a dream, it was reality. And now the moment had come to finish what destiny had begun. Her lips parted, and the chamber leaned forward as one, waiting. Her voice came soft, trembling at first, but carrying a weight that silenced even the boldest noble. It was a word older than the stars, older than the council, older even than the chains forged to hold the dragons. It rolled from her tongue like fire, low and resonant, not loud but unstoppable. The chains trembled, cracks glowing with molten light spreading across their length. The dragons roared together, their voices joining into a sound that shook the heavens with every beat of their wings. The air filled with storms. With every flame from their throats, the marble floor glowed red. The guards dropped their weapons, their courage shattered as the beasts tore against their bonds. Sparks burst across the chamber, and then, with a deafening thunder, the first chain shattered one by one. The shackles broke, each snap louder than the last, like mountains crumbling into the sea. The dragons rose, their wings stretching wide for the first time in centuries. The fire in their throats poured out, not in rage but in release, a storm of flame and wind. That shook the chamber to its core. Nobles screamed, some fled from their seats, others fell to their knees, and the council leader himself stumbled back as the power he once controlled slipped from his grasp. Yet the dragons did not attack. They did not tear the aliens apart as the nobles had feared. Instead, they turned their massive heads toward Alara, their eyes glowing not with fury but with recognition. They circled her, wings folding slightly as they lowered themselves into a protective ring. Their growls softened, and though fire still burned in their throats, it was not fire of destruction, but fire of loyalty. Alara felt the connection deepen, stronger than ever before. The dragons spoke to her in a chorus of thought and emotion, thanking her, praising her, binding themselves to her in a vow that no chain could undo. She had not simply freed them, she had become their chosen, the one voice they would follow, into storm and fire. She was no longer just a girl mocked for her humanity. She was the dragon speaker, and the galaxy would never forget her name. The serpent-headed noble collapsed against his seat, his voice breaking as he screamed, "She cannot be allowed to live. Kill her. Kill her now." But no one moved. The guards shook with fear, their weapons useless. The nobles whispered in terror, and the council leader himself stood in silence, his glowing eyes dimmed. For all their power, all their centuries of rule, they had been undone by a single human word. Alara stood tall, the dragons surrounding her like living walls of fire and iron. Her eyes burned with resolve, and though she said nothing more, the message was clear. The council no longer held power. The chains were gone, and with them, the illusion of control. The girl they mocked had spoken the word of power, and the storm she unleashed would echo across the stars, the new legend. The chamber that had once been the throne of galactic power now lay in ruins of silence and fear. Smoke curled from the broken chains, firelight danced along the marble walls, and the sound of massive wings folding into stillness filled the air like the echo of thunder fading into memory. The nobles who had mocked so freely only hours before now sat in trembling silence, their proud faces pale with terror, their jeweled robes clutched tight as though fabric alone could shield them from the storm that had passed. No one laughed. Now no one dared, for before them stood a girl who had done the impossible. Alara remained at the center, her small frame surrounded by giants. The dragons circled her not as predators but as guardians, their eyes glowing with fire yet softened with recognition. Their roars had died down into low growls that reverberated like ancient drums, warning all who looked upon them that they belonged to her now. She had not taken them by force. She had not broken them with whips or chains. She had spoken, she had listened, and they had chosen her. In that moment, the balance of the galaxy shifted, for the greatest weapons of the council had become loyal to a single human word. The council leader stood rigid in his seat, his glowing eyes dimmed with fear. The robes that once symbolized his command now looked heavy, like chains he could not escape. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. You do not know what you have done, girl. The dragons are chaos. They will bring ruin to every world. They cannot be controlled, not even by you." His words fell weak, crumbling into the silence that surrounded them, and for the first time in centuries, the authority of the Galactic Council was not law, but a whisper drowned by fire. Alara turned her gaze toward him, her voice calm but steady. "You do not understand. They are not beasts of chaos. They are not weapons. They are living, breathing beings who suffered under your chains. You mocked my humanity as weakness. But it was my humanity that allowed me to hear them, to understand them. You could never command them because you never listened." Her words carried through the chamber, each syllable striking deeper than any blade. The nobles lowered their heads, unable to meet her eyes, for in them they saw not a fragile human, but the reflection of a power they had never believed possible. The serpent-headed noble hissed from his corner, his hatred sharp even in his trembling voice. "This is a curse. You have doomed us all. The dragons will rise against every star, against every world. You will not be remembered as a savior, but as the spark of destruction." His words slithered through the silence, but none answered him, for even those who had once agreed with him now stared at the girl in awe, unable to deny what they had witnessed. The dragons shifted again, their massive wings scraping against the chamber ceiling, sending dust and sparks raining down. They looked not at the nobles, not at the guards, but only at Alara. Their bond was undeniable, and every alien who witnessed it knew the truth. If she wished, she could command them to burn the chamber to ash. She could destroy the council in one single word, and no power in the galaxy could stop her. The silence pressed tighter, heavy with expectation, waiting for her choice. Alara closed her eyes for a moment, her breath slow. She had felt the rage of the dragons, their desire to strike back at those who had enslaved them. She had felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon their souls, and she knew that one command of vengeance would be enough to satisfy their hunger. But deep inside, she also knew that vengeance would not bring peace. It would only replace chains with fire, and humanity would be remembered not for hope, but for destruction. Her heart, fragile yet unyielding, carried a different strength, the strength to choose mercy. When she opened her eyes again, they blazed with fire, not of wrath, but of resolve. She raised her voice, clear and strong. "Do not destroy. Protect." The words rang through the chamber like a bell struck at the dawn of a new age. The dragons roared in unison, their voices shaking the marble and cracking the air, but they did not burn. Instead, they spread their wings wide and formed a circle of protection around Alara. Their fire turned not against the nobles, but against the shadows of the hall, creating a blazing shield that sealed her safely within their embrace. The council gasped in disbelief. The dragons had obeyed not a command of war, but of peace. They had chosen not to kill, not to rage, but to guard. And it was in that moment that the galaxy understood the truth. The girl who spoke to dragons was not a destroyer, but a protector, a leader born not of fear, but of compassion. The legend was no longer just of chains broken, but of a bond unshakable. Whispers spread like waves through the chamber, carried into the ears of every noble, every guard, every witness. "The human commands them," they said. "The dragons have bowed to her will." Some called her savior, others called her curse, but no one could deny the truth. She had become something greater than the council, greater than prophecy itself. She had become the beginning of a new story. The council leader lowered his gaze, his voice hollow. "The galaxy will remember this day." He spoke not as a ruler, but as a defeated man, his power broken before the fire of a human's word. The nobles who had mocked humanity now trembled at the thought of Earth, for if one girl could command dragons, what else could humanity achieve? Alara stood still, her hand pressed against the dragon's snout, her heart heavy yet unshaken. She knew this was only the beginning. The council would not forgive, the nobles would not forget, and war would surely follow. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. The dragons, once chained and silenced, were with her, and their bond would echo across the stars. And so the story spread, whispered from one world to another, from one fleet to the next. The tale of the human girl mocked for her weakness, who spoke a word and commanded the mightiest creatures of the galaxy. The tale of a bond that reshaped the balance of power and ignited hope where there had once been only chains. She was no longer Alara the fragile. She was Alara the dragon speaker, the human who changed everything. And as the dragons roared once more, their voices rising into the heavens, the sound carried beyond the council chamber, beyond the planet, beyond the stars themselves, announcing to the galaxy that a new legend had been born, one that would never be forgotten.
Thank you for joining Eternal Human Spirit, where humanity always rises again.